The boy arrived at the academy on a cloudy morning when the sky looked as unsure as he felt. He stood outside the wide glass doors for a few moments, staring at people rushing in and out. Some carried polished violin cases. Others walked with their chests lifted, holding portfolios or perfectly tuned instruments. They all seemed to know exactly what they were doing. The boy, however, felt like an outsider who had wandered into the wrong place. In his hands, he held an old keyboard bag. The strap was frayed on one side, and the zipper had been replaced with a safety pin, because the original one broke months ago. He kept adjusting the bag on his shoulder as he walked inside, afraid someone might notice how worn out it looked. He didn't want to draw attention to himself, but it was impossible not to stand out in such a polished environment. The floors shined. The walls were covered with photos of successful students, smiling confidently as they performed on grand stages. Everything looked expensive, delicate, and untouchable. He stepped forward slowly, trying to blend into the background, but his quiet presence only made him more noticeable among all the confident faces. As people passed, he could feel their eyes scanning him up and down. Some gave quick glances at his old keyboard case and then at his plain clothes. He had worn the cleanest shirt he owned, but it was still far from what others were wearing. The more he looked around, the smaller he felt. A group of students stood near the reception desk, laughing among themselves. One of them pointed in the boy's direction, whispering something that made the others look back. They laughed again. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to sting. The boy lowered his eyes and tightened his grip on his bag, reminding himself that he wasn't here to impress them. He was here to play. He repeated that in his mind, but even so, insecurity grew inside him like a knot farther down the hall. A staff member guided students to different rooms. He was an older man with sharp eyes and a stiff posture, clearly someone who had spent years in this academy. The way he carried himself made him look important, even intimidating. When the boy approached him to ask where he should go, the man barely looked at him. He just nodded toward the far end of the building, his voice short and clipped as he gave directions. It was as if he had already decided that the boy wouldn't be worth his time. The boy followed the directions and soon found himself at the entrance of a large audition hall. The door was left slightly open, and from inside he could hear the soaring notes of a violin. The sound was powerful and clean, nothing like the scratched old tones of his keyboard at home. A small crowd waited outside, sitting on chairs or leaning against the wall. They flipped through sheet music, stretched their fingers, or practiced in the air as if warming up invisible instruments. He quietly took a seat at the far end of the row, hoping nobody would notice him, but of course someone did. A tall boy holding a fancy digital piano case nudged the person next to him and tilted his head toward the newcomer. "Look at his keyboard," he whispered, not nearly softly enough. "You think that thing even works?" The person beside him snickered. The boy pretended he didn't hear, but his ears burned. He stared at the floor, focusing on his shoes. One of the soles had loosened slightly, and he hoped nobody noticed that either. Minutes passed sluggishly as more contestants were called inside. Every now and then, applause echoed from behind the doors, followed by excited murmurs. Each time it happened, the boy felt a mixture of admiration and fear. Admiration for the talent he could only imagine was being displayed inside. Fear because he wasn't sure he belonged among these people. He wondered what the judges would think when they saw the old keyboard his mother had cleaned up as best as she could before handing it to him today. She had smiled at him gently and said, "Just play with your heart." He held on to that memory now, trying to find comfort in her words. Eventually, the door opened again. But this time the applause that floated out sounded different, more polite than impressed. A girl walked out with stiff shoulders and trembling lips. It was clear she hadn't done as well as she had hoped. The boy felt her disappointment, like a wave. She avoided eye contact with everyone, her expression tight and vulnerable. He watched her walk away, feeling sympathy rather than judgment. He knew how much courage it took to step into that room. Time kept passing, and the pressure in the hallway grew heavier. The air felt full of nerves, as if everyone was holding their breath. Some people whispered to each other to calm themselves. Others kept practicing the same movements repeatedly. The boy watched them in silence, feeling more and more distant from their world. He didn't have fancy training. He didn't have expensive teachers. He didn't have proper lessons in technique. All he had was the sound he had learned to create out of nothing sound he shaped late at night when everyone else slept. He wondered if that would be enough here. Then the director appeared. The hallway shifted instantly. Conversation stopped. Backbones straightened. Even the staff looked more alert. The director was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a voice that usually filled a room before he even spoke. His suit was sharp, his face stern, and his eyes constantly searching for flaws. Everyone knew him. Everyone feared him. He had built a reputation for being harsh, brutally honest, and sometimes unkind. But he also discovered some of the Academy's greatest talents. That was why people accepted his attitude. They believed his judgment was always right. He walked past the waiting students, glancing briefly at each one. When his eyes landed on the boy, he didn't hide the slight lift of his eyebrow. The glance was quick, but the message was clear. He had already judged him. One of the staff members leaned close to the director and whispered something. The director looked again in the boy's direction. Then, with a dismissive smile, he chuckled. "If that boy plays the piano well," he said loudly, making sure everyone could hear, "I'll kneel on this floor right here." Laughter broke out among the students, especially from the boy with the fancy piano case. Even some members of the staff smiled awkwardly. The joke traveled down the hallway, and the boy heard it repeated softly from one person to another. His face grew warm with embarrassment. He looked down, pretending to check his keyboard strap, but inside his chest something tightened. He didn't know whether to feel angry, hurt, or simply defeated. He had faced judgment many times before, in different places, from different people. But this one felt heavier, because the man mocking him was someone he admired from afar, someone he once dreamed of learning from. The boy took a long breath, trying to stop his hands from shaking. He reminded himself why he came. Not for approval, not for applause, but because playing music made him feel alive, even on the days when everything else felt difficult. He closed his eyes for a moment and pictured his mother's tired smile as she encouraged him to go. She believed he deserved this chance, even if nobody else did. The auditions continued one by one. Finally, after what felt like hours, a staff member stepped out of the room and called out, "Next." The boy looked around, expecting someone else to stand. When nobody did, he realized it was his turn. His heart thudded loudly, but he stood up slowly, gripping his keyboard case firmly. The hallway felt unusually quiet. Even those who had been laughing now watched with curiosity. The director folded his arms and smirked, clearly expecting a performance that would only prove his joke right. The boy took one final breath, steadying himself. Then he walked toward the door, pushing it open gently. The sound of the room's silence swallowed him as soon as he stepped inside. He didn't know what would happen next. He only knew he had to try. The boy stepped inside the audition room, shutting the door behind him as quietly as he could. The room was bigger than he expected. The ceiling felt high, almost like a small concert hall, and the walls were lined with thick panels meant to absorb sound. Everything in the room, from the polished floor to the tall windows, felt too perfect, too distant from the world he came from. A long table stood at the front of the room where 3 judges sat. They looked experienced, confident, and strict in their own ways. They didn't smile. They didn't even pretend to be warm. They simply watched him the way people study something they aren't sure is worth their time. The boy lowered his eyes slightly as he walked to the small setup area, where a chair and a stand were placed for him. His heartbeat echoed loudly in his ears. He tried hard not to show it. He gently placed his old keyboard case on the floor and unzipped it with slow, careful movements, as if the simple act of unzipping it might reveal every fear he carried inside. The keyboard inside wasn't new. It had scratches on the sides, and one of the keys stuck slightly at the corner. But he had played on it for years, and despite its flaws, it had become part of him, like a friend that had never left. He lifted it, set it onto the stand, and plugged in the power cord. The small click of the switch sounded loud in the quiet room. He could feel the judge's eyes on him, but he kept his focus on the keys. They were slightly yellowed compared to new ones, but to him, they were familiar and comforting. "State your number," one of the judges said. His voice was low, calm, and completely devoid of emotion. The boy cleared his throat softly. 17. The judge nodded and wrote something on his clipboard. It was a simple interaction, but the boy still felt like he had to work twice as hard just to stand in that room. A moment of silence followed. Then, another judge leaned back in her chair and tapped her fingers lightly, signaling that he should begin whenever he was ready. He sat down slowly, feeling the weight of the moment settle onto his shoulders. His hands hovered above the keys for a second, trembling slightly. He took a slow breath. He had practiced this piece so many times at home late at night, early in the morning, whenever he found a quiet moment. But here, everything felt different. The air was heavy. The expectations felt unforgiving. He closed his eyes, letting his mind drift back to where his music began. Back to the small room he shared with his mother. Back to the nights when she came home from work, tired but still asked him to play something for her. Back to the day she brought home the broken keyboard she found near a dumpster, smiling even though her eyes showed exhaustion. "Maybe you can fix it," she had said. "Maybe it'll help you dream bigger." The memory softened his breathing. His fingers steadied. When he finally touched the first key, the sound that came out was soft, gentle, almost unsure. But it was real. It was his. And with each passing second, the hesitance faded. The melody began to form, flowing slowly at first, then gaining strength. The judges watched without expression, but something in the air shifted. The boy didn't notice it at first. He was lost in the music, lost in the story he had woven into each note. He played with the same sincerity he played with at home, not for applause or approval, but because the music inside him needed to be heard. As he continued, the sound seemed to grow warmer, richer. He wasn't playing a complicated classical piece like many others had. He wasn't performing something famous to impress the judges. He was playing something he had created on his own, something born out of the difficulties he lived through, the quiet moments he spent alone, and the hope he carried even on the hardest days. The melody rose and fell like a conversation. Some notes were sharp with emotion, others soft like whispers. It felt personal, almost intimate, as if he were sharing a part of his heart that no one else had ever seen. The judges exchanged glances. Even the one who looked the strictest leaned forward slightly, listening more intently than before. From outside the tall windows, a faint breeze moved the curtains, and a small patch of sunlight shifted across the floor, brushing against the boy's hands as he played. He didn't see it. His eyes were still half closed, his mind drifting through memories of moments that shaped the boy he had become. He remembered practicing in the hallway of his building because the sound echoed nicely there. He remembered the neighbors who sometimes walked past him with tired eyes, but still smiled when they heard him play. He remembered saving coins for months to buy a new adapter when the old one stopped working. He remembered everything that led him to this moment. Slowly, the melody reached its most emotional point. His fingers pressed harder, then softer, as if they were telling a story of struggle, hope, and determination. Then, like a deep breath released, the piece softened again. The final notes lingered briefly in the air before fading into silence. For a moment, the room felt completely still. The boy opened his eyes slowly. His chest rose and fell as he tried to steady his breathing. He didn't know what to expect. He didn't know if he had made a mistake, or if the simplicity of his piece made him look unprepared. All he knew was that he had played honestly. The judges didn't speak right away. They simply stared at him, not in the judgmental way he feared, but in a different way. A quieter way. A thoughtful way. The strictest judge cleared his throat. "Where did you learn to play?" he asked. The boy hesitated. "At home," he said. "Mostly by myself." The judge's eyebrows lifted slightly. He scribbled something quickly on his sheet. Another judge leaned forward. "That piece. Did you write it?" "Yes," the boy replied softly. The judge nodded slowly, her eyes studying him with new attention. The silence that followed wasn't heavy anymore. It was curious. After a moment, the judges thanked him and signaled that he could pack up his instrument. Their voices sounded calmer, more measured. The boy wasn't sure what that meant. He didn't know if it was good or bad. He simply nodded politely and began to pack his keyboard. As he zipped the case, he could feel the weight of their attention still on him. It made him uneasy, but at the same time, for the first time since stepping into the academy, he didn't feel invisible. He carried his keyboard toward the exit and paused briefly before opening the door. A small thought crossed his mind. Maybe this wasn't a complete disaster. Maybe, just maybe, they had seen something in him. When he opened the door and stepped into the hallway, the conversation stopped again. All eyes turned to him. Some people looked surprised to see that he was not shaking or crying. Others looked confused, as if unsure what had happened inside. The director, who had been leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, looked up with the same dismissive expression he had before. But something flickered in his eyes when he saw the boy, just a small shift, barely noticeable. The boy didn't hold his gaze for long. He lowered his eyes and walked past the others, moving back toward his seat. He sat down quietly, placing the keyboard beside him. People whispered. Some leaned closer to each other, trying to guess whether he had played well or failed badly. But the boy didn't listen. He stared at the floor, trying to calm the mixture of relief and uncertainty inside him. A few minutes passed. Then the door to the room opened again, and one of the staff members stepped out with a list in hand. "We'll announce the first group chosen for the next round shortly," he said. The boy felt his heart lift slightly, then drop just as fast. Hope was dangerous, he had learned. Expectations often led to disappointment. But something inside him refused to let go of that tiny spark. He closed his eyes for a moment and took a long breath. Whatever happened next, whether he was chosen or not, he had played with everything he had. He had carried his story into that room. And no matter what the judges decided, nobody could take that away from him. In the hallway, tension grew again as people whispered and fidgeted nervously. But the boy sat quietly, holding on to the memory of the melody he had just played. It felt like a small victory, even if nobody else recognized it. He didn't know it yet, but something had changed in that room. Something the director and judges could not ignore. And the boy, still unaware of the shift his music had created, simply waited, with hope tucked carefully inside his quiet heart. The hallway felt heavier with each passing minute. People sat upright, leaning forward, whispering in tight circles. Some rehearsed finger movements in the air, as if the results might change if they repeated their warm-ups. Others paced back and forth, wearing deep lines of tension across their faces. The boy sat quietly among them, hugging his keyboard bag close to him as if it could shield him from the eyes that kept drifting in his direction. Even now, after returning from his audition, he could feel the echo of the room inside him, the bright lights, the judge's concentrated stares, the soft trembling in his hands. He kept replaying small moments in his head, the slight pause before he began playing, the way the final note seemed to hang in the air, the expression on one of the judge's faces when he mentioned that the piece was his own. Every detail felt sharp, like it had carved itself into his memory. A few seats away, two boys talked loudly, their voices echoing through the hallway. One of them carried a violin case decorated with stickers from competitions. The other had a tablet open, scrolling through sheet music. "Do you think they'll pick someone like him?" One of them said, not bothering to lower his voice. The boy didn't look up, but he felt the words press into him. "I mean, come on," the violinist continued. "This is an academy for real musicians." His friend let out a small laugh. He looked like he found that keyboard in the street. The boy kept his eyes on the floor. He didn't know if they were talking about him specifically, but he didn't need to know. He had heard enough comments like that his whole life to understand the tone. Across the hallway, the director stood with one of the judges. They were speaking quietly, but their voices still carried hints of seriousness. The director's expression was sharp as always, but there was a small crease between his eyebrows that wasn't there earlier. It was faint, but it suggested he was thinking about something that bothered him. He looked over at the boy again. This time, the boy felt it. A direct stare, strong enough that he lifted his eyes for a moment. The director didn't look away. He studied the boy with the same intensity he used when reviewing difficult performances. The boy quickly lowered his gaze again, unsure what to make of it. Was the director trying to figure out how he ended up here? Or was he simply waiting to prove himself right about his earlier joke? The uncertainty twisted inside the boy like a knot just then. The staff member who had gone inside earlier returned with a sheet of paper in hand. The hallway shifted instantly, as if a wind had blown through it. Conversations stopped. People stood up straighter. Some reached for their bags instinctively, as if preparing for whatever came next. "We will now call the participants who will move to the next stage," the staff member announced. The boy's heartbeat rose sharply. He didn't breathe. Nobody did. A staff member began reading names. Each one echoed sharply in the still hallway. Some students gasped with relief. Others slumped back in their chairs, disappointment clouding their faces. The boy listened closely, gripping the handle of his keyboard bag. The list continued. Each name felt like a step closer to either a door of possibility or a wall of rejection. Then, suddenly, his number was called. His head lifted fast. For a moment, he wondered if he had misheard. But the staff member repeated it clearly. There was no mistake. A wave of warmth and shock ran through him. It felt unreal. He almost didn't know how to react. He looked down at his hands, expecting them to tremble, but they didn't. They felt strangely still, grounded. Around him, some people turned and stared. He caught the eyes of the boy with the fancy piano case, the one who had laughed earlier. The boy looked startled, almost confused. He blinked a few times as if trying to understand what had just happened. The director, who had been watching silently, straightened a little, his arms uncrossed. His expression remained unreadable, but something inside it softened just slightly. The boy lowered his head again, unable to handle so many eyes on him at once. He simply stood up when his group was told to gather near the left side of the hallway. He joined the others, clutching his old keyboard case to his chest. Some students whispered to each other, throwing quick glances his way. A few looked surprised. Others looked irritated, as if his being chosen somehow threatened their place. He didn't blame them. He understood it. Everyone here had worked hard. Everyone here dreamed of being chosen. But he also knew something they didn't. Behind his quiet face and worn-out instrument, he had poured his whole life into the keys he touched. Maybe someone inside that room had felt it. When the next stage group assembled, the staff member instructed them to follow him to another room. The boy walked behind the others, careful not to bump into anyone. His heart still beat loudly, but with every step, a tiny spark of confidence flickered inside him. They entered a rehearsal room that was smaller than the audition hall, but still impressive. A few chairs were arranged in a semicircle, and instruments rested neatly on stands around the room. The boy looked at the grand piano in the corner. It shone under the overhead lights, its polished surface reflecting everything around it. He swallowed hard. He had never played on something like that. The director followed the group into the room, and everyone fell silent again. He walked slowly to the front and faced the students. "You've made it to the second stage," he said. His voice was firm, but not unkind. "But don't think this means you're safe. The next part will be harder. We want to see how well you adapt, how you work under pressure, and how much you are willing to grow." His eyes swept across the room, pausing only briefly on the boy before moving on. "We don't only watch how you play," he continued. "We watch how you carry yourself. We watch how you react to mistakes, how you communicate, how you listen. Being a musician isn't about showing off. It's about connecting." The boy felt those words land deeply. Connecting. That was the only reason he ever played. The director clapped his hands once. "You will split into pairs. Each pair will be given a short piece to perform together. You'll have very limited time to prepare. We want to see how well you collaborate." Pairs began forming quickly. Students gravitated toward familiar faces or people they already knew. The boy stood still, unsure where he fit. Just as he was about to step toward a group, a voice called out from behind him, "Hey." He turned to see a girl holding a flute case. She had been sitting quietly during the waiting period, observing more than talking. She gave him a small, uncertain smile. "Do you want to pair up?" He blinked, surprised. He wasn't used to someone approaching him first. "Yes," he said softly. "If that's okay." She nodded. "Yeah, it's okay." The staff member handed them a simple duet piece, nothing too complicated, but still challenging enough to require coordination. The boy studied the sheet. The arrangement had long, flowing flute lines with steady piano support beneath. They sat down on opposite sides of a small practice table. The girl opened her flute case carefully, checking each piece before assembling it. The boy set up his keyboard with practiced motions, placing it gently on the stand. "So, you write your own music?" she asked without looking up. The boy felt his face warm slightly. "Sometimes." "I thought so," she said with a nod. "I could hear it. You play differently." He didn't know if that was meant as a compliment or simply an observation, but it eased something inside him. He nodded once, grateful. They began practicing slowly. At first, the timing felt off. The boy adjusted his playing to match her tempo. Then she adjusted hers to match his. They stopped, laughed softly, and tried again. For the first time since arriving, the boy felt the tension ease from his shoulders. They didn't judge each other. They didn't rush. They simply tried to understand the piece together. Minutes passed as they practiced, correcting small mistakes, repeating difficult measures. Little by little, the music began to blend. Her flute lines floated like soft wind above his steady chords. The melody felt gentle, almost soothing. The director walked around the room, observing each pair carefully. When he stopped behind the boy and the boy felt his breath catch. He immediately straightened his posture and tried to appear composed. The director listened for a moment, his face unreadable. Then he nodded subtly and moved on. The boy exhaled slowly once the director walked away. He watched us for a long time. The girl whispered. The boy nodded quietly. I know. Maybe that's a good thing, she added. He wasn't sure. But he hoped so. After the practice period ended, the director called all the pairs to the center of the room. Each pair performed one by one. Some were confident. Some stumbled. Some played with perfect technique, but no emotion. Others played with heart, but lacked experience. When it was their turn, the boy and the girl walked to the front. His pulse quickened, but he kept his breathing slow. They exchanged a small nod, a silent promise to support each other. He played the opening chords gently, allowing her flute to enter smoothly, lifting the melody above the piano line. As they played, the boy let go of the fear he carried earlier. He focused on the flow of the music, the rise and fall of the notes, the connection between the two instruments. When they finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Then the director gave a short nod. Good, he said. Nothing more. But that one word felt like sunlight. The boy stepped back, feeling a warmth he couldn't fully explain. As the session ended and students began packing up, the girl turned to him again. Part 4 story of 1700 words will be written here in simple English without headings. Following all your instructions. The afternoon sun was slowly dipping behind the tall buildings when the boy followed the director into the rehearsal hall. The large room looked almost empty, yet it carried the weight of decades of music, victories, failures, hopes, and dreams. Wooden floors held scars from thousands of footsteps, and the air still smelled of old varnish and long-used piano keys. The boy stepped inside quietly, as if afraid the room itself might reject him. The director walked with long, confident steps, but something in his movements had softened. Maybe it was the memory of how boldly he had laughed earlier. Maybe it was guilt. Or maybe curiosity had taken hold of him so strongly that he couldn't shake it off. Either way, he was different now. He didn't look down on the boy the way he had in the morning. Come in, the director said, not turning around. Close the door behind you. The sound carries better when it's quiet. The boy nodded, even though the director wasn't looking, and shut the door gently. The faint click echoed through the empty hall. In the center of the room stood a piano, an old black upright piano with scratches along its sides and a small crack in its front panel. It had seen many hands through the years. Some gentle, some arrogant, some hopeless, some brilliant. The boy walked toward it slowly, almost like approaching a sleeping animal. Sit, the director said. The boy sat on the wooden bench. His legs dangled a little because he was smaller than most students who used this hall. He placed both hands on his lap first, waiting for permission. You said you could play, the director said, standing a few steps behind him. Let's hear it. His voice was calmer, now still strict, but no longer mocking. The boy didn't move for a moment. He looked at the keys silently, his fingers twitching slightly. There wasn't fear in his eyes, only an overwhelming rush of memories. As if he were seeing something far more important than a piano, he lifted his hands slowly. But before he touched the keys, he whispered something barely audible to himself, like a prayer or a reminder. The director couldn't hear the words, but he saw the boy's shoulders rise with a deep breath. Then the boy began to play. The first note landed softly, almost fragile, trembling on the air. The second note came stronger. By the third, the sound had found its shape. In seconds, the hall that had felt empty was overflowing with music, gentle at first, then blooming with confidence. The director's eyebrows rose in surprise. He stepped closer without realizing it. The boy's fingers moved with a natural flow, not stiff or forced, but steady and warm. His small hands traveled across the keys with a smoothness that didn't match his age or his simple clothes. He didn't look at the director. He didn't even seem aware of the room anymore. It was as if he had fallen into another world one where everything made sense. He played a tune that was both sad and comforting. It had the feeling of rainy afternoons, old memories, and someone waiting by a window. The director felt a strange heaviness settle in his chest. He had heard thousands of students, talented ones, gifted ones, confident ones. But this was different. There was honesty in the boy's music. Halfway through the piece, the boy's fingers slowed. His expression changed slightly. His lips pressed together, and his brows pulled inward as if remembering something painful. The music followed, dipping into a softer, almost trembling melody. The director swallowed. He could tell this wasn't just skill. This was emotion carved into sound. When the boy finally stopped, the last note hovered for a long moment before dissolving. The hall returned to silence, but it was no longer empty. It felt full of meaning, full of something the director couldn't name. The boy slowly lowered his hands. He didn't turn around. He didn't smile. He didn't ask how he had done. He simply waited, breathing softly, fingers resting lightly on the edge of the bench. The director stood completely still. He had nothing to say at first. He wasn't used to being speechless. Words usually came to him with certainty, but now they felt clumsy. Where did you learn that? He finally managed. The boy shrugged lightly. At home, on the small keyboard. His voice was quiet. That wasn't a beginner piece, the director said. And it wasn't played like someone practicing. You played it like... He stopped. His throat tightened again. Like someone who has lived through something. The boy didn't answer. The director walked around to stand beside him. He wasn't towering over him anymore. He stood more gently, observing the boy's face. There was innocence in the boy's eyes, but also a kind of understanding that most children didn't have. Play another one, the director said. The boy nodded. This time he played something brighter, cheerful, like children running through a park or someone laughing freely. His fingers danced faster, hopping between keys with a lightness that made the piano sound younger than it was. It was as if the boy knew how to make the instrument breathe. When he finished, his small shoulders relaxed a little, and he looked at the director for the first time since the music began. The director exhaled slowly. You're exceptional. He rubbed the back of his neck. I shouldn't have spoken the way I did earlier. The boy lowered his eyes. It's okay. It's not. The director shook his head. I misjudged you. I thought you were only trying to impress the students. But I see now. You weren't doing this for attention. He paused. You love this, truly. The boy nodded faintly. The director leaned against the piano gently. Listen, he said, his voice softening even further. There are many who play with skill, but very few who play with heart. You have both. That is rare. The boy didn't know what to say, so he stayed quiet. After a long moment, the director straightened up. I want you to join my advanced piano program. The boy looked up in surprise. But I don't have money. I can't pay fees. The director shook his head. I didn't ask for money. His voice softened. I'm offering you a place because you earned it. The boy blinked slowly, unsure if he had heard correctly. You'll practice here, the director said. You'll learn from me. You'll use this hall, this piano, everything you need. The boy sat frozen. I'm not doing you a favor, the director added. You're doing us a favor by being here. The boy's lips parted, but no sound came out. But then the director did something the boy never expected. He knelt. The same director who had laughed earlier. The same man who ran one of the toughest music programs in the city. He knelt beside the piano bench, not out of humiliation, not out of pity, but out of respect. I said something foolish today. he said quietly. "I said I would kneel here if you could play." He looked at the boy with a small, apologetic smile. "And you played far beyond anything I imagined." The boy's eyes widened, startled. "You don't have to." "I do," the director insisted. "Not because I'm forced, but because I want to honor my words." The boy felt the weight of the moment settle around him. He had never seen an adult someone in power admit something like this so honestly. "Stand up, please," the boy whispered. The director rose slowly, dusting off his knees with a quiet laugh. "Fair enough." He looked at the boy with softened eyes. "From today onward, you will train here, and I will personally teach you. But there is one condition." The boy waited. "Don't hide your talent again," the director said. "Don't play small just because life hasn't been fair to you." The boy swallowed, feeling something deep inside him shift, something like courage. He nodded. "Good," the director said. "Now go home and rest. Tomorrow we start fresh." The boy stood up, still absorbing everything. He took one last look at the piano, the instrument that had changed his day, maybe even his whole life. As he left the hall, he placed his hand gently on the doorframe, as if thanking the room for listening to him. The director watched him go, feeling a strange warmth in his chest. He knew he hadn't just discovered a talented boy. He had witnessed the beginning of something rare, something that could grow into greatness if handled with care. And for the first time in a very long time, he felt hopeful. Little did either of them know, this was just the beginning. The real challenges, the real changes, the real moments that would shape both of their lives were still waiting beyond the next sunrise. But for now, the director walked to the piano, placed his hand on the keys, and quietly whispered to himself, "What a day." Part 5 story of 1,700 words will be written here in simple English without headings, following all your instructions. The next morning came with soft light slipping through the cracks of the old apartment window where the boy lived. He woke up earlier than usual, long before most people in the building even stretched their arms. His excitement wasn't loud or wild. It was quiet, like a gentle warmth inside his chest that had grown overnight. He sat at the edge of his small bed, rubbed his eyes, and whispered to himself, "Today I start." It felt unreal, like he might still be dreaming. But the memory of yesterday, the piano hall, the director's changed expression, the feeling of the keys under his fingers, confirmed it was real. He quickly got dressed in his simplest clothes, the same ones he wore almost every day, because his family didn't have much. Before leaving, he glanced at the small keyboard sitting on the table. Some keys were chipped, a few were slightly stuck, and its speakers crackled sometimes. But it was still his most precious thing. He touched one key softly. "Thank you," he whispered, as if the keyboard had carried him this far. Then he left the apartment quietly, so he wouldn't wake the neighbors. The streets were cool and peaceful at that hour. Shops were still closed, and the city felt half asleep. The boy walked with quick steps, his heart beating faster, the closer he got to the music center. When he reached the building, the sun had just risen enough to cast a warm glow on its tall glass windows. He hesitated for a moment. The place looked big and important, like a place meant for people with proper clothes, expensive shoes, and polished confidence. "Do I belong here?" he whispered. But then he remembered the director's words from yesterday. "Don't hide your talent again." He took a deep breath and pushed the door open. Inside, the hallways were still quiet. Only a few staff members were around, sweeping floors or preparing classrooms. The boy looked around, unsure if he was too early. Then he heard footsteps. The director appeared at the end of the hallway, holding a cup of tea and wearing a slightly wrinkled shirt, as if he had arrived in a hurry. "You're here early," the director said, trying to sound serious, but a hint of a smile tugged at his lips. The boy lowered his head shyly. I didn't want to be late. Good, the director said. Come, we'll start in the small practice room today. The boy followed him down a hallway lined with doors. Each one had a small window and the faint sound of instruments inside. The director stopped at one of the rooms and opened the door. Inside was a glossy piano, much newer and larger than the one in the main hall. The boy stared at it the way someone might look at a treasure. Sit, the director said. Setting his tea down. The boy sat on the bench. Before we do anything difficult, the director said, play something simple. I want to see your hand posture, your touch, your timing. Don't rush. Start with whatever feels natural. The boy nodded and placed his hands on the keys with surprising ease. He started with a slow, gentle melody he used to play on his small keyboard at home. The sound of the full piano was richer, warmer, almost alive. As he played, the director watched carefully, arms crossed but eyes calm. The boy's hands were small, but they moved with intention. His fingers curved naturally. His shoulders were relaxed. And most importantly, he didn't play mechanically. He played like he meant every note. After a while, the boy stopped. The director let out a slow breath. Good, he said quietly. You have instincts most children don't, but instincts alone won't get you far. We need discipline, technique, and structure. I can learn, the boy said quickly. I know, the director replied with confidence. That's why you're here. The director moved to stand beside him. Today, we begin with basics. Your basics are good, but they need polishing. First, your finger strength. The boy listened closely. For a pianist, the director said, tapping lightly on the top of the piano, fingers must be strong but flexible, like branches that can bend without breaking. He demonstrated a simple warm-up exercise. Then he told the boy to copy it. At first, the boy struggled a little. His hands weren't used to long hours of practice on full-sized keys. But each minute, he improved. The director corrected his wrist angle gently, adjusted his elbow height, and reminded him to breathe. Good, he said again. They practiced for more than an hour. Scales, patterns, slow movements, fast movements. The boy never complained, even when his fingers began to ache slightly. He only paused to shake his hands before returning to the keys. You don't give up easily, the director observed. The boy shook his head. If I stop, I won't get better. The director nodded in approval. After a break, the director asked him to play one of the pieces from yesterday again. The boy picked the bright, cheerful one. His fingers moved with more confidence this time, and even though he made a few mistakes, he corrected them quickly. Good recovery, the director said. Recovering from mistakes is more important than playing perfectly. The boy smiled a little. They continued until noon. When the director finally said, That's enough for today, the boy looked almost disappointed. You can come every morning, the director said, noticing his expression. Just like this. We'll train step by step. No rushing. The boy nodded eagerly. The next day, he returned. And the day after that. And the day after that. Days turned into weeks. Each morning, he arrived before anyone else. He practiced scales until his fingers tingled. He played new pieces the director assigned him, some slow and emotional, others fast and tricky. The director watched him with growing admiration. The boy was not only talented, he had discipline, humility, and a quiet determination that refused to fade. One afternoon, after a long session, the director sat on a chair while the boy took a small break. Why do you play so seriously? The director asked, not in a strict voice, but in a curious one. The boy looked at his hands. Because it makes me feel. Okay? The boy nodded. When things are hard at home or outside, the piano makes everything quiet. It makes me feel like I belong somewhere. The director felt a tug in his chest. He didn't press further. The boy wasn't someone who talked much about his feelings, and the director respected that. But he understood, better than he expected. As weeks went by, the boy started gaining attention. Sometimes older students peeked through the window of the practice room, curious. They whispered among themselves, surprised that a small boy played with such depth. Some were impressed. Others were jealous. But the boy didn't pay attention. He only focused on the keys. One day, the director called him to the main hall again. "I want to see how you handle pressure," the director said. "Sit." The boy sat at the upright piano. "Today," the director said, "I'm inviting a few instructors from the center to listen to you. Nothing formal. I just want them to see your potential." The boy froze. His hands trembled slightly. The director knelt beside him, lowering his voice. "Look at me." The boy looked. "You have nothing to fear," the director said. "You are not being tested. You are sharing. Just like you shared with me on the first day. Remember that." The boy took a few deep breaths and nodded. Soon, 3 instructors entered the hall. They sat quietly in chairs off to the side, their faces unreadable. "Play what you played that first day," the director said. The boy nodded and placed his hands on the keys. The moment he started, the hall filled again with that warm, fragile sound that carried memory and emotion inside every note. The instructors leaned forward slightly, surprised. He played beautifully, more confidently than before, but still with the same raw sincerity. When he finished, the hall fell silent. One instructor whispered, "Incredible." Another nodded slowly. "He plays with feeling most adults work years to develop." The boy looked down. Shy. The director felt a quiet pride grow inside him. But it wasn't just pride. It was responsibility. Heavy, but meaningful. When the instructors left, one of them stopped beside the director and said, "If you guide him well, he can go very far." The director nodded. "I know." He watched the boy run his fingers gently over the keys again, lost in thought. This small child, who had walked in shy and overlooked, was becoming something extraordinary. And the director was beginning to realize something else. The boy was also changing him. The director had spent years teaching students who were focused on trophies, competition, recognition. But the boy didn't want any of that. He only wanted the music, and that reminded the director of the passion. He once had the passion he had forgotten. Late that afternoon, after the lesson ended, the boy stood up to leave. "I'll see you tomorrow," he said softly. The director nodded. As the boy walked out. The director whispered to himself, "He doesn't know it yet, but he's going to touch a lot of hearts." And deep inside, he knew part 6 of their story, the part neither of them expected, was already on its way. Part 6 story of 1,700 words will be written here in simple English, without headings, following all instructions. The day of the small performance arrived sooner than the boy expected. It wasn't a grand concert or anything large, but to him, it felt like the most important day of his life. The director had planned it carefully, not as a competition or a test, but as a chance for the boy to feel what it was like to play in front of people who were really listening. The center held a monthly gathering where students performed short pieces to get used to audiences. Most students treated it like a casual event, something routine, something they didn't think much about. But the boy treated it like a turning point. He woke up early, just as he always did. But instead of rushing, he sat on his bed for a few minutes. His hands were resting in his lap, fingers slightly curled, almost like they were sleeping too. He took a deep breath and whispered with a smile, "I'm ready." Even though he said the words, he wasn't completely sure. But sometimes, saying a thing out loud gives it strength. He wore the same clothes he always wore. He didn't have anything special to change into, But he didn't feel bad. The director had told him, "The piano doesn't care about what you wear. It cares about what's inside you." Those words stayed with him. When he reached the center, the hallways were busier than usual. Students carried sheet music, parents chatted quietly, instructors moved around setting things up. The boy stood near the entrance for a moment, feeling a little lost. Then he heard a familiar voice. "There you are." The director approached him, hands in his pockets, a warm expression on his face. "Come with me," he said. "We'll warm up in the small room before the event starts." The boy followed him. Inside the practice room, he sat at the piano as he did every day. But today, his hands trembled slightly. "Nervous?" the director asked. The boy nodded. "A little? That's good," the director said. "It means you care." He rested a hand gently on the boy's shoulder. "Listen, today isn't about impressing anyone. Today is about sharing your music. Think of the piano as a friend you're talking to. Nothing more." The boy nodded again, taking a deep breath. "Warm up," the director said. The boy played a few scales. Slowly first, then faster. His fingers loosened. His shoulders relaxed. When he finally played a small melody, the director smiled. "You're ready." They walked together toward the small performance hall. The seats were slowly filling. Children whispered excitedly. Some parents pointed at their kids, adjusting their clothes or fixing their hair. Everything felt loud and busy. The boy clutched his hands together as he watched. The director leaned down slightly. "Stay beside me," he said. "You're not alone." The event started with a brief introduction from one of the instructors. Then the first student went on stage, a tall teenager who played a lively piece. People clapped politely. Then another student played. Then another. The boy watched each performance carefully, not comparing himself, just observing. Finally, the director tapped his shoulder gently. "You're next." The boy's heart began to race. He stood slowly, feeling the weight of the moment. The director walked him to the side of the stage. "Remember what I told you?" the director whispered. "You're sharing, not competing." The boy nodded. The instructor called his name. The boy stepped onto the small stage. The lights weren't too bright, but they were enough to make him blink. The audience looked bigger from up there, rows and rows of faces watching him. He walked to the piano bench and sat carefully. For a moment, he didn't move. His hands rested gently on his lap. Then slowly, he placed them on the keys. The hall went completely quiet. He began to play. The first notes were soft, almost shy, but warm. As the melody grew, his confidence grew with it. His fingers moved like they always did, smooth and steady, telling a story that only he understood fully. People in the audience leaned forward slightly. Some smiled. Others closed their eyes. A small child in the front row whispered to her mother, "He's really good." The boy's melody shifted into something deeper, something emotional. It wasn't sad, but it carried a kind of longing, like reaching for something just out of distance. And even though no one knew his life, or the struggles he faced, or the loneliness he sometimes felt, they felt it in his music. That was the magic of it. When he reached the final notes, the sound lingered briefly. Then silence, a long, complete silence, and then applause. Not polite. Routine applause. Real applause. Warm. Full. Honest. The boy blinked in surprise. He wasn't expecting such a reaction. He stood slowly, bowed shyly, and walked off stage. As soon as he stepped behind the curtains, the director was there waiting. "You did it," the director said softly. The boy looked up. Were they clapping for me?" The director laughed. "Of course they were. They felt your music." The boy lowered his head, hiding a small smile. For the rest of the event, he sat beside the director, listening to other performers. But he didn't feel nervous anymore. He felt light, like a weight had lifted from him. When the gathering finally ended and people began leaving, several instructors approached the director. "That boy," one said, "he has something very special." Another nodded. "You should consider entering him in the winter showcase." The director nodded thoughtfully. "I've been thinking the same." The boy wasn't listening closely. He was watching the piano on the stage with quiet admiration. The director touched his shoulder. "Let's talk outside." They walked out into the cool evening air. The sky was painted with soft colors from the setting sun. Today was only the beginning. The director said. The boy nodded. "It felt nice." "More than nice," the director said. "You moved people. That's not something you can teach. You were born with it." The boy fiddled with his fingers. "Do you think I can get better?" The director stared at him with gentle seriousness. "You can become incredible. Not because of talent alone, but because of the way you work, the way you feel, the way you listen." They stood quietly for a moment. Then the director continued. "There is a winter showcase in a few months. It's much bigger than today's event. Only a few students are chosen to perform there. I want to recommend you." The boy's eyes widened. "Me?" "Yes, you," the director said. "But it will take hard work, more discipline, more practice. Are you ready for that?" The boy didn't hesitate. "Yes," the director smiled. "Good. Starting tomorrow, our training becomes harder." The boy swallowed nervously, but stood tall. "Okay." Over the next several weeks, training did become harder. Much harder. The director pushed him to improve his hand strength, speed, control, and emotional range. Some days the boy left with tired hands. Some days he almost fell asleep on the bus ride home. But never, not once, did he complain. Every morning, he returned with quiet determination. The director watched him grow not only as a pianist, but as a person. The boy became more confident. He spoke a little more. He smiled a little more. He held himself differently. That one evening, during a late practice session, the director noticed something. "You've changed," he said. The boy looked confused. "Changed?" "Yes," the director said. "When I first met you, you looked like someone who didn't believe they deserved to be here. Now, you look like someone who knows they've earned every minute of it." The boy lowered his gaze. Touched by the words, "Thank you," he whispered. The director felt a warmth spread in his chest. The night of the winter showcase finally arrived. The hall was larger than anything the boy had ever seen. Tall ceilings, shining lights, rows of seats that seemed endless. Backstage, he sat on a small bench, hands folded together. His heart raced, but strangely, he wasn't afraid. He was excited. The director knelt beside him, just as he had on the first day. "Remember who you are," he whispered. "Remember why you play." The boy nodded. When his name was called, he walked on stage with steady steps. The audience was quiet. The piano waited. He sat. And played. The music that came out of him that night was different from anything he had played before, not because the notes were harder, but because he played from a place of growth, strength, hope, and truth. He didn't just play a piece. He told a story, his story. When he finished, the audience rose to their feet. Applause thundered through the hall. The boy looked out at the crowd, stunned. He turned his head slightly. The director was standing backstage, watching with proud eyes. In that moment, both of them knew something. This wasn't the end. This wasn't even the peak. This was the beginning of a life shaped by music, courage, and a promise the director had once made jokingly, but kept sincerely. The boy stepped off stage, breathless, and the director placed a hand on his shoulder. "You did it," the director said softly. The boy looked up. "We did it." And the director smiled, knowing the boy was right. Their journey had started with laughter, doubt, and a challenge, but it continued with honesty, growth, and music powerful enough to change both of their lives forever.